If you're a fan of sport, wherever you live, you'll probably know the name Celtic. The football club, playing in their green and white hoop shirts, are famous across the world, and despite coming from the small country of Scotland, have one of the biggest fan bases of any soccer team. It was founded by a member of the Marist Brothers religious order almost 150 years ago to help poor families in the East End of Glasgow, Scotland's biggest city. But Celtic have come a long way from those humble beginnings. In the 1960s, they were the first British team to lift the European Cup trophy, beating the football aristocracy of Italy's Inter Milan.
And the whistle is going, and Celtic have won the European Cup!
With strong links to the Scottish and Irish diaspora around the world, for many of its supporters, Celtic is more than a football team, it's part of their identity and their history. The club is also one half of one of the greatest rivalries in football. It contests the Old Firm derby against the team from the other side of Glasgow, the equally historic and hugely supported Rangers. But as well as Celtic's sporting glory, there was a much darker legacy beginning in the late 1960s. A horrific scandal involving the physical and sexual abuse of dozens and dozens of young boys. For decades, operating almost in plain sight, children were abused on an industrial scale. Numerous, now convicted paedophiles operated at the Celtic Boys Club, a youth team very closely linked to Glasgow Celtic.
Tonight on Reporting Scotland, the founder of Celtic Boys Club has been found guilty of sexual offences against 3 boys in the 1980s and 1990s. James Torbett founded the club with the permission of Celtic Football Club in 1966. Tonight we can reveal he'd previously been convicted of abusing...
The former coach of Celtic Boys Club, Frank Kearney, has been jailed after being convicted of 9 sex offences against boys as young as 12.
Good evening. A former kit man and coach with Celtic youth team, who also coached Celtic Boys Club, has been jailed after pleading guilty to a series of child sex abuse crimes. 73-year-old Jim McCafferty has already served time for child sex abuse offences in Northern Ireland.
In the view of many, Celtic Boys Club was the central connecting point in a ring of football paedophiles whose activities amount to one of the largest, if not the largest, historic abuse scandals in British sport. The victims, now grown men, want justice and they want to tell their story. I'm Peter Henderson. I've been a journalist, a news producer, and for almost 7 years now I've worked closely with the people who are trying to secure that justice. I've spent time with many victims of the Celtic Boys Club paedophiles, listening to their stories and hearing how they've been affected. I've worked with the lawyers representing the victims and with the accomplished journalists who've looked for the truth. Because here's the issue. Celtic Football Club have never properly apologised to the victims of the Boys Club. Despite the Boys Club using the same badge and colours, despite some of the abuse happening at Celtic's own training ground, and despite the Boys Club appearing almost every week in Celtic's official newspaper, the senior club say the Boys Club was a completely separate entity. Celtic has expressed sorrow and regret for what happened at the Boys Club, but says it's not their responsibility. But something changed. A change in the law means victims are now able to make legal claims for compensation for lives devastated and careers ruined. Almost 30 victims are bringing a class action case against Celtic, arguing that the senior club is indeed liable for the sickening abuse they suffered. So that's what this podcast is about. Over the coming weeks, I'm going to bring you the inside story of the case against Celtic Boys Club.
A paedophile ring operated at the heart of Celtic Boys Club for more than 30 years, and children who were entrusted to that organisation were abused year after year, decade after decade, broken child after broken child. It's an absolute scandal that's at the heart of Scottish football and certainly at the heart of Celtic Football Club.
You just heard there from the senior lawyer leading the action, but you'll also hear from the journalists who have covered this story over the decades.
He would lie in bed at night and pull his hair out because he didn't want to fall asleep, because he knew he would dream and relive all these nightmares that he'd gone through. It was that bad that he said he contemplated taking his own life.
I'll also speak with the dedicated counsellors who have tried to help the victims.
A child has got no chance at all of getting away from the child abuser. The fear and the terror is off the scale.
But most important of all, we'll hear from the survivors of the Celtic Boys Club paedophile ring. Many of them have never spoken before.
I just froze. I freaked out. That happened in the dressing rooms at Barrafield. That happened in his motor. We were all young boys, 14, 15, so nobody was going to really say anything because would they have been believed?
He abused me in my home one night when my mum and dad were lying in the next room. It scares me now, thinking what would have happened if my mum and dad had walked into that room. My dad would have killed him.
And this gang of evil child molesters' tentacles stretch much further than Scotland. The Boys Club paedophiles carried their abuse south of the border, where they had close connections to one of England's most notorious child abusers. Their abuse followed them to continental Europe, to North America, and most recently to a bolt hole in Southeast Asia. They used children's love of sport to carry out Britain's most complex and longest-lasting football child abuse scandal, a scandal where many issues are yet to be resolved decades after it began. So please, do hit the subscribe or follow button to make sure that when new episodes are released, you get them sent straight to you, whatever podcast platform you're using. This podcast will be free, and it's very important to me that it is free so as many people as possible can listen to it. But if you want to support the work of the small team who produced the podcast and help tell the story of the victims of the Boys Club, there's a Patreon link in the show notes. If you're able to make a small donation, it goes a long way to help keep the podcast going. Thanks for your help, and speak to you in episode 1.